Thank you for joining us for what will be 30 minutes where we try to tackle the future of the digital economy. We have three fantastic panelists. Jody, who is the MD of CoinDesk Indices, a leading crypto index provider. Jason, who is the COO of the Stellar Development Foundation. And Danny, who is a senior fellow of the Filecoin Foundation. So what we have is an index provider who's going to try to put into context and provide some frameworks for advisors and for your clients on how to think about this fast and evolving and ever-changing ecosystem. And two of the most successful or very successful foundations or protocols with very specific use cases that are disrupting some of the biggest industries out there. Stellar being a blockchain that is disrupting global payments, and Filecoin, a blockchain that is disrupting the data storage industry. So we're going to dive right in and start with you, Danny.
Okay.
Could you give us, I guess, just a little bit of context, try to bring the audience up to speed on where we stand today with the evolution of blockchain and the next cycle.
The last 500 years of blockchain story.
Yeah,
I think people try to characterize this as like Web 1, Web 2, Web 3. And I don't really think of these things as sort of replacements. They're more like sequels to one another. I think if you really did pan out to this whole thing from 40,000 feet, I think you would see the development of the internet and all of these things that we're seeing now as pretty much a straight line. The big thing that led to so much innovation in the early days of the internet and a lot of wealth too, was that it was doing something that people didn't really expect, right? Which was creating a public utility, a public network that was entirely decentralized. You know, you couldn't point to someone and say, that person owns the internet or that person's in charge. And all the innovation came from the edges. So as the internet got bigger, the more innovation there was. And this is kind of that classic Silicon Valley idea of, you know, the two people in a garage without connections except their, you know, little modem, creating a billion-dollar industry. So we had that for a while. We had that again with the web. And then there was this weird period that we're kind of just coming out of now, where that innovation around the edges, that decentralized feature of the network, kind of ebbed away as a few big, very innovative organizations kind of worked out how to redirect a lot of that wealth into those organizations themselves. So we had this slowing down of innovation, and we had these giants, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, the usual selection, kind of become these quasi-monopolistic organizations. So the place where Web3 and the blockchain fitted into that is that the original kind of Bitcoin paper and stuff like that harkened back to a bunch of the technology and thinking that was actually going around in the early internet. And that's given and encouraged a lot of the same kind of innovation in a bunch of different spaces. I mean, like the early internet, mostly kind of geeky to begin with, right? And then the obvious ones like cryptocurrency. And I think what we're seeing now is a bunch of new innovative spaces, a sort of Cambrian explosion of innovation with lots of different sectors and lots of little things popping off, all being innovated on the edge rather than the center monopolies.
Great, thank you. And I guess just in the grand scheme of things, we're still very early, right?
Yeah, I mean, people always are like, oh, we're in like 1993 or we're in, you know, 1984. I mean, I think we're kind of in 1976, which is great for the music. And like, you all should think of like, you know, that's when Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak and Apple started. And you had these very clunky kind of like personal computers that could just play Space Invaders. But a $1 trillion industry was built on those shoulders.
Okay, awesome. Jody, we're going to shift to you. I know you and your team have done a ton of work trying to define and put into context a framework around this whole ecosystem, and you built a digital asset classification system and recently launched the CMI. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
So I think that where we are today, right, if we're in 1976, what was happening in 1976 in the stock market, Vanguard had just launched their mutual fund. There were only 4 sectors at the time. Financials was the 4th, added on to the transportation, industrials, and utilities. And the fund that was launched was really unpopular because it was so risky. And we were approaching the recession of the early 80s, which feels a lot like today, where we've got high inflation and rising rates, and we needed the development of a derivatives market in order to manage that risk, which we're getting slowly but surely in crypto. There's new contracts coming out every day. And as we grow and as more digital assets have been developed, there really is a need to organize and categorize and define the industries of digital assets. Just as not all of the stocks are the same, neither are all of the digital assets by their use cases. So very much how you might think of equities having technology or financials, energy, healthcare. We've got now digital assets that are categorized by 36 different industries that we've defined that roll up into 23 industry groups that are well defined and 6 sectors. And the sectors behave differently, and they're starting to line up with their equity counterparts. So, for example, DeFi, decentralized finance, is looking a lot like finance, whereas you might see video games in the metaverse looking a lot like leisure and entertainment. So as a portfolio manager, I would look to what are the use cases of the digital assets you're interested in, and how do they align with the equities that you hold so that you can maximize your diversification and really reach the goals that you're trying to reach.
Okay, awesome. And I guess just diving into some of the more specific use cases, I don't know, Jason, if you want to touch on Stellar and where you're innovating and how you're disrupting global payments.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm from a foundation called the Stellar Development Foundation, and we are the creators of and we shepherd the code base of a public blockchain called Stellar. And Stellar was designed back in 2014 is when it launched, and it was designed for asset issuance and payments. So some of you may be familiar with the term stablecoin. I like to think in terms of cryptocurrencies and stablecoins. So cryptocurrencies would be like Bitcoin, of course, is the classic example. There's no TradFi. There's no traditional finance analog to Bitcoin. Stablecoins, on the other hand, are backed by some real-world currency. So, for example, there's an asset called USDC, which stands for USD coin. That's issued by a company called Circle. That's a stablecoin. And so what we at Stellar are trying to do is innovate in the area of payments using blockchain technology. So especially when it comes to cross-border payments, some of you may be aware of how complex and slow and at times expensive a cross-border payment can be. And in a lot of cases, that's a result of correspondent banking, which is in order to send money from one country to another, you need to find a chain of banks that all bank with each other, and that's how you do that transfer. The promise of blockchain is that instead of having these siloed, disconnected systems, you can have a single shared infrastructure, a single ledger that you can use to make that payment. So on blockchains like Stellar and others as well, we focus very much on facilitating those cross-border payments using these stablecoin assets. And there's a variety of other use cases as well. We are a public blockchain, so anyone who wants can build on that, but that's very much the use case that we're the most focused on. And I think, as Jody was talking about, there are these different industries. Sometimes people think, they think mostly about the cryptocurrencies and just sort of buying it and then maybe it'll go up, and they don't dig into those fundamentals. And so in our case, we're very much in that payment space, and then other chains are like the chain that Danny works for, work on different use cases.
Okay, awesome. And Danny, I guess, could we touch on the use cases around Filecoin?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Filecoin is definitely one of these examples where you have this basic technology and an opportunity to create an entirely new sector from it. So the space that Filecoin works in is decentralized storage, and I think that the easiest way to think about this is I think most people know that there's a multi-billion-dollar market in data storage and cloud storage, but a lot of that is effectively owned now by these giants, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, etc. And so for them, there's a monopoly advantage there, right? So they can charge for egress, they can make you pay for a little bit extra for storing the data, and of course, because the data is with them, when it comes to processing that data, you have literally one place that you can go, and it's the people who are already taking your money. So the way Filecoin works is it uses these decentralized features of blockchains, but also just of the internet itself, and it enables like smaller storage providers to pull together and create a market. It's a bit like Uber, it's a bit like Airbnb. I hate to make those comparisons, but in that idea of having an open market where people can put data in, but rather than, again, having a single organization or company kind of extracting that value gets effectively reflected in the token itself, the Filecoin, right? So everybody's using it is sort of sharing in that benefit. And the main benefit for the consumer, there's an obvious one for people providing these storage capabilities, because they suddenly get to compete again in a global market. The advantage for consumers is what we're seeing is prices for storage going down to about 0.5%, like 0.05% of the Amazon fee. And what that means is that people can start thinking about storage that didn't really exist, right? There's less competing with the existing centralized system, but going, oh wow, now I can store a petabyte on the cloud, whereas before that would have been, cost me $20,000 a month. That now costs me $200. I can really think about data storage, data warehousing, and stuff like that. So again, I think the thing to know is that these are connected to pre-existing sectors, but they're charting new territory and new opportunities, not just for the people who are building these new chains, but for the businesses that will be able to take advantage of that innovation.
Great. And I guess the adoption of Filecoin as that solution, happy with the progress and...
Yeah, so we're at the point now where, and I don't want to go into the strange crypto economics about this, but like the whole thing is this amazing kind of machine for incentivizing people to come into and get involved. But we've now got the total capacity of about 10% of Amazon, which, is good to be going on with for now. It's 18 exabytes, so if you have geeks in your family, they will be immediately trying to work out how many movies you can put in that. It's a lot. Again, the thing that you have to understand with these things is that they're not traditional companies so much as new markets, and they're markets that will grow and their value will be reflected as new people enter it rather than as one company takes control.
Okay, great. I guess tipping back out to the macro, Jody, again with these two examples, fantastic, innovative blockchains. How does the advisor sort of keep track, when there's over 20,000, and how do they apply, a lens to invest on behalf of their clients?
Yeah, these are two terrific examples of different use cases, right? I mean, we've got Filecoin, it's a shared service that's part of the computing sector, and we've got Stellar Payments, that's part of the industry group, blockchain as a service, part of the currency sector. So what are all of these things? Well, what we've taken the liberty to do is define them in a glossary. All of the industries, the industry groups, and sectors. And when I tell you It's the most interesting glossary that I've ever read. It really, I thought it would be so boring, but people need the education to get an understanding of what these different use cases are. So, if we think about, well, what is currency or what is computing, it's really important to define that. And while the assets may be different than some of the assets or equities that we know, there is a way that they rhyme with traditional asset class frameworks. For example, maybe Bitcoin is not the dollar or gold, but it is considered a store of value in a super asset class framework, as opposed to Ether, which can be a capital asset because it can generate income by owning a piece of the global settlements layer, or you've got it to be more like a commodity because for every computational step on Ethereum, ETH has to be burnt, so it's very much like a transformable or consumable asset. Or it can be a store of value also because you can lend it in the digital asset space. So when you're putting together asset class allocations, you can now take the broad asset class, put it into the asset allocation model that you might have to act as a guide to get an understanding of how much you might want to allocate based on your goals. And then you can actually measure the performance of these different sectors or the entire asset class, and you can decide whether to allocate actively or passively. I actually feel like in digital assets, because of its emerging nature, there's still a lot of active alpha opportunity. And then you can see how you did. You can do an attribution analysis and figure out whether you did a good job or not as compared with what the general segments are telling you. So I think that the allocation process is extremely similar to any alternative asset class, and how you consider it is probably a lot how you might think about hedge funds. Like if you were to do a long-short equity strategy, is that sitting in your equity bucket or is it sitting in an alternatives bucket? When you look at digital assets, if you're allocating to something like DeFi, do you look at the correlation to your traditional finance sector and your S&P 500, or is it a different thing entirely? And I think that those kinds of factors are the things that you'd be looking at to allocate across digital assets.
Cool.
And I'd actually like to add something to that, I think in general, probably for this audience and most audiences, when thinking about digital assets, you're thinking about sort of investing in or getting involved in this brand new thing. So like Filecoin, for example, that's this new use case. And blockchain technology, of course, has the promise for all sorts of new stuff. I think it's also worth mentioning blockchain will also affect traditional assets. So for example, on Stellar, actually, Franklin Templeton has tokenized a money market fund. So the asset itself is a normal money market fund, shares of a money market fund. No innovation there. It's merely tracking those shares in a new way, on a blockchain instead of in a centralized ledger. So I think that's another important category to think about, that especially for all of you, for wealth advisors, there are going to be these sorts of new asset types that, as Jody is pointing out, they're not so new. You can analogize. But then there's also the stuff you're familiar with, but you may, and quite frankly, I think you will increasingly see those things still using blockchains in various ways, whether to record ownership or to settle transactions. Even though they're not new assets, it's a new way of using them. I think that's an important point.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I guess, I don't know if you could articulate the benefit of doing that. Money market funds have been around. What is the benefit of tokenizing a regulated asset like that?
Yeah, again, it's the shared infrastructure point. So, people often talk about payment rails, and like it's kind of a corny analogy, but I like to think we should be building payment highways, because highways have multiple lanes. You can change lanes. They're more flexible. Right now, we have a set of infrastructure built up for securities, a set of infrastructure built up for dollar payments, for commodities, etc. If all of those different assets are tracked on a single infrastructure, it's all interoperable. So it becomes easier to exchange, to buy and sell. On top of that, there are potential cost savings. Think of all of the work and effort that goes into maintaining that centralized ledger, all of the expense that goes into being a transfer agent. If those assets are instead tracked on something like a public blockchain, all of that is taken care of. So those are some of the benefits, the interoperability and the potential cost savings.
Got it. Okay, great. And I guess maybe, Jason, could you just speak to CBDCs as well in that regard?
Yeah, so CBDC stands for Central Bank Digital Currency. So, you might have heard of like a digital dollar, or China really has been pretty far ahead of this, and the digital yuan. That's another good example of, obviously that's not a new asset. The dollar is not a new asset. It would simply be representing the dollar in a new way. So there are a lot of conversations about that. Interestingly, you may have heard of Facebook Libra, which was a project that Facebook announced, and a lot of regulators around the world got very nervous about that, and that interestingly catapulted the CBDC discussion forward by, it might not be an exaggeration to say 10 years. This thing that governments were not talking about before and were not taking seriously, when Facebook started to hint at sort of launching their own currency, they said, whoa, we need to look at this very seriously. So I think something like over 80% of central banks around the world are actively exploring a CBDC. That does include the US. The thing I'll say is it's going to be very case by case. It's not going to be like every country is all of a sudden going to have a CBDC. For some countries, it's going to make a lot of sense. For others, it's not going to make as much sense. But again, the vision, the promise is that it could be an asset that lives on this shared infrastructure, and it's interoperable with all of these other assets and all of these other businesses. So it's a very exciting area, but I think the key point is it's going to be case by case. It's going to depend very much on the circumstances of each country.
Great. And China is actually testing their CBDC right now in real time.
They are. There are a lot of design choices to be made. China's is rather centralized, whereas some of the other pilots and designs are considering even issuing on public blockchains. So they're I don't know what year to say it is for CBDCs, like the 70s. It's very early. There's a lot of promise to CBDCs, but there's also a lot of monetary policy and very macroeconomic considerations to be made. So central banks are, I would say, correctly being very careful about this and thinking very methodically about how to design them and how to roll them out.
Okay, great. And we're going to get to some audience questions. So if you guys have questions, please use the Slido app, and we'll tackle those. I guess, Danny, are there other, non-Filecoin examples that you think resonate with people?
No, it's just Filecoin. Yeah, I do. I think. I'm not a finance person, right? I'm a technologist. So the bit that always interests me is these new applications that have new uses, right? So one of the ones I do like, actually, I was on a panel with somebody from it a month ago, is the Helium network. And just to not do their pitch for them, but I think it shows the potential variety with Helium. Basically, they use this decentralized thing to build up a wireless network. They're originally starting with a low data network. Actually, the same one as Amazon is trying to roll out with its Sidewalk proposal. And the idea is you set up a little box in the corner of your home or on your roof, and you get rewarded for people using it, which is such a simple idea, right? But it's incredibly complicated to actually do unless you have the benefit of all of these new innovations. And the thing that I find fascinating about that is that, as you might imagine, San Francisco, my hometown, is absolutely saturated. It's very hard to make money on this network in San Francisco. So people are buying these things and going out to their holiday homes and setting them up there, which of course is exactly what you want when you're growing a network, and is the very places that traditional networks find it hard to capitalize on. So I just like it because I can literally watch a map and see this particular new way of capitalizing, growing into the spaces that the traditional market wouldn't.
Okay, great. All right, we've got a couple questions here. How would you respond to naysayers who claim the entire digital asset ecosystem is only propped up by the greater fool theory?
I can start that one.
Are you the lesser fool in this? Or?
I don't know. I think I'm a bit of a medium fool. I think what this person might be, I'm assuming what they're talking about is sort of this notion that much of what goes on in DeFi is very Ponzi-ish. And I don't know, some of you may be familiar with a podcast called Odd Lots. It's a couple of Bloomberg journalists and a guy named Sam Bankman-Fried, who's the founder and CEO of FTX, which is a major crypto exchange. He was on there, and he made a lot of headlines in our industry because he was essentially asked, is a lot of DeFi Ponzi-ish? And his answer was sort of, yeah, kind of. Yeah. So I assume that's what this person is referring to. What I would say is, like any new industry or new technology, or quite frankly, any new human endeavor, there's a lot of crappy stuff going on, and there's a lot of great stuff going on. So is there some stuff that absolutely is all about greater fool? You're just buying something hoping that some fool will buy it for more from you? Of course. But as Jody was pointing out, there's also all of this wide variety of stuff going on in the greater blockchain industry, and there are actual fundamentals under a lot of this. Like Filecoin is a great example. Of course, I'm biased, but I would say Stellar is another great example. So I would answer that person and say, sure, some of it is greater fool, but that's not all of it. There's all sorts of other stuff going on.
Great. Jody?
Yeah, so before I joined CoinDesk, I was the chief investment strategist at Morgan Stanley in their wealth management division. And around the global pandemic, we got tons of questions from our clients about Bitcoin and crypto, and I was probably the biggest skeptic. I was like, what do you need it for? Do you want diversification, inflation protection? Are you trying to get yield? Are you just wanting to speculate? Like, what is it that you need? And pretty much no matter what it was that they needed, I could find an asset that I knew better that would fill that goal. And we just kept getting asked the questions by some really smart people, some of the largest CIOs of pensions, foundations, endowments, and I thought there's got to be more to this. So I started really looking into it and learning about it. And it fit really well with my background. I used to program casino games and video games when I was in college. So yeah, one of those geeks. Anyways, once I understood the cryptography, the blockchain technology, the immutable ledger, I could see the application and I could see the investment case, and then we recommended up to investors about 2.5% allocate to Bitcoin or crypto. And as I learned more and more, I thought, I've got to get into this. I got to spend my full time on this. And what I would say to anybody who's skeptical is to really dig in and learn about it, because I think once you learn, you'll understand that it's just not what's the value of Bitcoin? Is it going to go up and down? It's not that. It's so much more than that, and it's going to revolutionize the way that technology works and that industries today across the board either store information, use information, generate technology. It's really valuable. So that's what I would say.
I mean, I think you don't have to be kind of wide-eyed about it, right? Like, I think you can be pretty hard-nosed, right? Like, as it diversifies into all of these sectors, look at the use applications, read these things that people are writing with a skeptical eye, right? Like any press release, go, what are they really saying here? They got some name attached to this, but like, what's really going on? And I think those instincts will serve you very well, because what's exciting about it is not the theory, right? What's exciting is about how the theory is really going to touch real lives and real products in the next 10 years.
All right. I think we are out of time. I'd like to thank all of our panelists and all of you for joining us, and I think we're ready for the next session.